The kukri, the weapon of choice of the feared Gurkha soldiers, the indispensable tool of the Nepalese worker, and a blade of unyielding strength. This is the Knife Life, and today we're going to be delving into the design and history of the kukri. If a machete, axe, and boomerang all walked into a bar, the punchline would be the kukri. But there's nothing funny about the kukri. It has survived the East India Trade Company, 2 world wars, and persists on the battlefield today. And perhaps even more impressive is its toil on the work field, where the kukri is put through tasks many blades would not survive. Because of its ruggedness and utility, it has spread to many other parts of the world and is often emulated. So what exactly defines a kukri and what has made it so successful? Let's take a closer look at the design itself. All kukris have a long blade with a forward cant. The blade has a noticeable swell after the bend in the blade, which then tapers down to a point. When picking up a kukri, you will notice that the weight of the blade is located far up on the blade, and it almost feels more like picking up an axe than a knife. This seeming lack of balance is intentional. Shifting the weight of the knife forwards means that the blade has more momentum through the swing and lets the weight of the blade assist the wielder's chop, resulting in a very powerful blow. The distinctive S-curve of the kukri provides its own benefits. Straight blades, such as the machete, lose leverage the further down the blade you go. Thus, less pressure is applied to the target that you're cutting. Blades such as the karambit and the gununting counteract this by angling the blade forwards. This makes for an aggressive cut, but this presents the tip as the leading point on a chop. Repeated impact on the tip is undesirable since it is the weakest point of the blade and in a utility setting, unavoidable. Additionally, such a tip would have a tendency to dig into the target like a spike, unlike the more desirable axe-like effect for cutting wooded vegetation. The solution is to curve the blade back, presenting the belly of the recurve as the leading edge. When cutting with the kukri, you'll notice that this area is really the cutting sweet spot, so to say. Another benefit to this edge geometry is that the blade can be grasped by the grip and behind the swell of the blade to use the kukri as a draw knife. Another interesting feature of the kukri is what's called a cho. While Indian kukris don't have one, almost all other kukris, except for the very oldest, have a cho. There's a lot of debate on what the cho is. One school of thought is that it is a sharpening choil. Others say that it's a blade catch similar to a Spanish notch, and yet another theory is that they are Hindu religious symbols. My personal favorite theory is that it's a sight to aim the kukri while throwing. I gave that one a try. I don't think that theory is right. Let me know what you think cho are for in the comments below, and if you're enjoying this video, consider liking and subscribing. Kukris are often accompanied by other tools that are stored in the kukri's sheath. The most common of these tools are the karda and chakmak. The karda is simply a small utility knife for tasks requiring a smaller knife, such as for skinning or eating. The chakmak is an unsharpened piece of steel that can be used for sharpening the kukri and the karda. Aside from overall general shape, kukris can vary quite a bit. Various sized fullers are often present. Overall length changes depending upon the desire of the owner. Utilitarian and military kukris are typically somewhere between 35 to 50 centimeters and single-handed. Ceremonial kukris for animal sacrifice are often larger and can be two-handed. Some kukris have a full tang while others have a half tang, but all kukris are large S-curved blades made with thick steel, and due to their utilitarian nature, are rarely decorated. Now that we have an idea of what a kukri is, let's take a look at its origins. The National Museum of Nepal has a number of kukris that are over 500 years old. Some historians believe that the kukri goes as far back as the 7th century, others not much older than the surviving examples. I can only tell you for certain that the modern kukri had emerged by the late 1500s. There are a number of theories on how the kukri evolved. A popular one is that the kukri evolved from the Greek kopis. If you look at a kukri and a kopis together, you'll note a remarkable similarity between the two. Now, some of you are probably asking, James, how did a classical Greek sword end up in a remote land 3,592 miles away? That is an excellent question. It's possible that the kopis could have made its way to Nepal via Alexander the Great's conquest, which expanded his empire to the Himalayas. Alternatively, trade routes through the Arabian Peninsula into India could have also introduced the kopis to the Nepal region. There is sufficient evidence of communication between India and the classical world to support this possibility. However, forward curved blades were not unique to the classical world. Archaeological evidence shows depictions of forward curving blades from around the 5th century. By the 10th century forward, curved blades were fairly common and had numerous varieties. The Mughal Empire made use of a number of forward curving blades. These blades could have evolved over time into the more familiar form of the kukri. It's also very possible that the kukri evolved independently in Nepal. Before the introduction of firearms, the primary arm of the Gurkha soldier was the kora, a one-handed sword weighted towards its tip and sharpened on the inside curve. The kora itself might have evolved from agricultural tools for the slaughter of animals. The kukri, in turn, could have evolved from that as a smaller secondary arm and utility tool. Of course, we don't know for sure what actually happened. Some blacksmith named Phil could have also accidentally kinked a knife and the fashion caught on. But my main question for that scenario would be why an ancient Nepalese smith was named Phil. The kukri came into the eye of the West in the early 1800s when the British East India Company came into conflict with the Kingdom of Nepal. The Anglo-Nepalese War lasted for 2 years, in which the Gurkha soldiers of Nepal demonstrated their worth as well as the effectiveness of their knives. The British quickly recognized the value of Gurkha troops and began recruiting them. Subsequently, Gurkha troops in service with the British Empire would be deployed throughout the world, bringing their bizarrely shaped knives with them. In spite of the widespread use of the kukri, the Nepalese military did not have a mass-produced model of the kukri in the traditional sense. This was due to the limited resources and capabilities of Nepalese industry. Nepal was not an industrial powerhouse. It had the capability to produce any modern arm domestically, but the issue was the scale of production. Firearms were the most important weapons needed, so resources were allocated accordingly. Military kukris from Nepal were thus handmade by a blacksmith working with whatever serviceable steel they could find, and the blades varied according to the preference of the Gurkha having the blade made. In spite of the variations in these blades, there is a lot of similarities between them as well. Smiths would be given a sample blade to replicate and would knock out an entire batch of new knives. The blades were differentially heat treated so that the edge was hardened to hold an edge, while the spine was left soft to toughen the blade. These kukris were also made with half tangs. The idea was that any grip would eventually fail. The half tang would flex some during hard use and absorb shock better. When the grip broke, the Gurkha could easily carve a new grip and glue it on. Much easier field repair compared to a broken full tang or through tang knife. Now, if you remember from earlier, kukris are not typically ornamental blades or particularly embellished, but there are some exceptions referred to as Kathamora kukris. Kathamora kukris became prominent in the 1800s and were carried by individuals of high rank or influence, such as kings, prime ministers, officers of Gurkha regiments, and so on. They were also used as gifts and presentation pieces. It's relatively easy to identify a Kathamora kukri, just look for the bling. But if you look closely at the actual blade of a Kathamora kukri, you'll see little ornamentation there. All of the decorations are located on the sheath and to the lesser degree on the grip. A quality, non-tourist Kathamora will be made of good quality steel, but aside from the glamour of its sheath, a Kathamora kukri varies little from more common kukris. In fact, some kukris were upgraded to a Kathamora. While the Nepalese military did not have the resources to mass-produce kukris, there was one entity that did. Remember our old friends, the British Empire? Some Brit in logistics decided that Gurkha knives needed to be standardized like other arms in the British Army, and thus the Mark I pattern kukri began production in 1903. These blades are also known as Great War kukris. Foreshadowing. The Mark I departed from the half-tang construction of the traditional kukri in favor of a through-tang construction. Similar kukris had previously existed in Afghan army blades, but the Mark I can be distinguished by the sunken circular nut at the bottom of the grip. Mark I patterns were heavy, poorly balanced, and had small handles. The Mark II replaced Mark I production in 1915 and substituted the through-tang design with a full-tang grip. Steel bolsters and butt caps were used, and the wooden scales were riveted into place. The Mark I and the Mark II, along with personally obtained traditional kukris, were the blades that saw use in World War I. Gurkha troops were found in essentially every major theater of the war. Production of the Mark II continued until 1944. Production of the Mark III began in 1943, and the two blades would serve together throughout World War II. The Mark III kukris were very similar to the Mark IIs, but the bolsters were discarded for ease of manufacturing in wartime. Gurkhas served in numerous theaters, but especially distinguished themselves in the tropical theaters such as Burma that the kukri was well suited for. The Mark III still remains the most commonly issued kukri for Indian Gurkhas to this day. The later Mark IV was designed in 1949 to 1950 and is very similar to the Mark III, but with a few improvements such as a chromed butt cap and tang. Very few still exist. Only about 1,400 were ever made, and most were likely destroyed through hard use in the Malayan and Borneo jungles. The final Mark V is a smaller and lighter blade with more focus on camp utility than as a sidearm. These knives evolved in the late 1950s to early 1960s. Many of these blades are of lesser quality, and it's not uncommon for Gurkhas to substitute these knives with their own privately purchased kukris. Mark V kukris are still produced by various companies, even though many will claim that they are the sole producer of the official military issue knives. Today, the kukri remains a cultural icon and symbol of Nepal, serving in everyday life, protecting the home, and participating in rituals and ceremonies. In spite of this, the kukri is gradually dying out as a tool to be taken everywhere. They are only seen in rural areas and are becoming overtaken by new technology and the evolution of culture. Chopping wood is less important with the increasing prevalence of gas, for example. The role of the kukri, therefore, is shifting more towards that of martial and ceremonial importance. One of the most interesting things that I learned about the kukri is the lack of research on this knife. In spite of its significance, few people have done any meaningful research into the kukri. There are many variations of the traditional kukri that have yet to be categorized, analyzed, and studied in depth. One of the few people involved in this is Mr. Kunwar of Heritage Knives. If you're looking to learn more about the kukri, Heritage Knives has the most complete compilation of documents and sources on the kukri. And while you're there, take a look at Heritage Knives products. His scholarship and love for kukris created the foundation for this video. Thanks for watching, and keep living the knife life.